The trees do not care about your maps or your GPS coordinates or the colorful nylon jacket you bought for $80 at the outdoor supply store. Out here in the deep pockets of the wilderness, nature is not a backdrop for your weekend adventure, but a cold and unblinking predator that has been waiting for thousands of years for someone to step off the beaten path. I have spent decades looking at these files, and the one thing that stays with me is the silence that follows when a human being simply ceases to exist in the middle of a crowded trail. People think the woods are loud, but when something goes wrong, the birds stop singing and the wind holds its breath as if it is afraid of being noticed by whatever just moved through the brush. We tell ourselves stories about bears and mountain lions because the alternative is far more terrifying than a set of teeth and claws. We want to believe there is a logical explanation for why a person can vanish in the time it takes to tie a shoelace or look at a compass. The date was the 2nd of October in the year 1999, and the location was the Big Thompson Canyon within the rugged boundaries of the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. It was a clear day with the kind of crisp mountain air that makes you feel like you could walk forever without getting tired. A group of 11 hikers was making their way up the trail toward the Comanche Peak Wilderness area, which is a place defined by jagged granite peaks and dense stands of spruce and fir. Among them was a 3-year-old boy named Jaryd Atadero, who was full of the kind of relentless energy that only a child of that age possesses. He was wearing a light blue pullover and a pair of cotton sweatpants, which is important to remember because of how quickly the temperature drops when the sun slips behind those high ridges. The group had spread out as hikers often do, with some of the more athletic members pushing ahead and the others lingering behind to take in the views of the golden aspen trees. Jaryd was running between the two groups, acting as a sort of bridge between the faster walkers and those taking a more leisurely pace. He was never more than a few dozen yards from an adult, and the trail was well defined with no treacherous drops or confusing intersections in that particular stretch. At one point, the boy ran ahead to catch up with the lead group, and he was seen by 2 fishermen who were standing near the bank of the river. They chatted with the boy for a brief moment, and he asked them if there were bears in the woods, because that is what children think about when they are in the mountains. The fishermen told him they had not seen any bears, and they watched him trot back up the trail toward the rest of his group. That was the last time anyone saw Jaryd Atadero alive, and the last time he would be seen as a whole human being for nearly 4 years. Within minutes, the group realized that Jaryd was no longer visible on the trail, and they began calling his name with a sense of mild annoyance that quickly curdled into a cold and paralyzing dread. They searched the immediate area, thinking he might have tucked himself behind a boulder or climbed into a hollow log for a game of hide-and-seek, but there was no response. The silence of the canyon seemed to swallow their shouts, and the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of pine and old stone. They notified the park rangers, and by that evening, a massive search and rescue operation was underway, involving hundreds of volunteers and professional trackers. They brought in bloodhounds because dogs are supposed to be the gold standard for finding the lost, but the dogs did something that would become a recurring theme in these strange disappearances. The animals reached a certain point on the trail and simply sat down, refusing to go any further, as if they had hit an invisible wall that their instincts told them not to cross. I have looked at the weather reports for that night, and they were brutal as the temperature plummeted toward freezing and a light dusting of snow began to coat the granite. If a 3-year-old boy was out there in cotton sweatpants, he would not have lasted long against the elements, but the searchers found absolutely nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt, and no scraps of blue fabric caught on the thorns of the mountain mahogany bushes, and no crying heard through the darkness. It was as if the earth had opened up and pulled him into the subterranean dark, without leaving a single ripple on the surface. The search continued for days and then weeks, with helicopters using thermal imaging to scan the slopes, but the sensors picked up nothing but the occasional deer or elk. The official narrative eventually settled on the idea that a mountain lion must have snatched the boy and carried him away, but there are significant problems with that theory that the authorities never want to discuss in public. A mountain lion is a messy eater, and it leaves behind a trail of blood and fur and bone that is easy for a trained tracker to follow, especially in the light snow that fell that night. There was no blood found on that trail, and no evidence of a struggle, and no one heard a scream, which is something a 3-year-old would certainly do if a 100-pound cat jumped on his back. Furthermore, a lion typically drags its prey to a secluded spot to feed, but the searchers covered every square inch of the surrounding terrain without finding a single clue. It was as if the boy had been lifted vertically off the ground by something that did not leave tracks and did not care about the laws of physics. We see this over and over in the national parks, where a person vanishes in a high-traffic area and the search dogs act confused or terrified, while the weather turns foul almost immediately after the disappearance. 4 years passed, and the case grew cold while the father of the boy refused to give up hope that some kind of answer would eventually crawl out of the shadows. In the year 2003, two hikers were moving through a steep and incredibly rugged area about 500 feet above the trail where Jaryd had vanished. This was an area that had been searched multiple times by ground crews and overhead flights, and it was a place that a 3-year-old boy could not have reached on his own. To get there, a toddler would have had to climb through dense thickets of tangled brush and scale steep rock faces that would challenge a grown man with professional climbing gear. It was on this high and lonely ridge that the hikers found a single tooth and a scrap of blue fabric that looked like it belonged to a child's pullover. When the investigators returned to the site, they found more fragments of bone and a pair of tiny shoes that were sitting neatly on a flat rock. This is another one of those details that keeps me awake at night because the shoes were not scuffed or worn as if they had been walked in for miles through the dirt. They looked almost brand new, and they were placed in a way that felt deliberate, as if someone or something had set them there for us to find. The clothing was turned inside out, which is a common phenomenon in these cases, and the skull fragment showed a strange hole that experts could not definitively link to a predator. If a mountain lion had killed the boy, the bones would have been crushed and scattered across a wide area, but these remains were found in a location that defied any rational explanation of how a small child could have traveled there. The authorities were quick to close the case and tell the family that their son had been the victim of a random animal attack, because that is the easiest box to check on a police report. But if you talk to the people who were actually on the mountain that day, they will tell you that the atmosphere felt heavy and wrong, as if the air itself had become thick and hard to breathe. There are theories about geological anomalies and portals and things that live in the deep caves beneath the granite, but the government does not want to talk about those things because it would ruin the tourism industry. If people knew that there were spots in our national parks where you could simply blink and disappear, they would never set foot in the woods again. We like to think we are at the top of the food chain, but out there in the high country we are nothing more than soft tissue and fragile bone. And something out there knows it. The case of Jaryd Atadero is not an isolated incident, but part of a terrifying pattern that stretches across the entire North American continent, from the peaks of the Cascades to the swamps of the Everglades. We see the same elements repeating themselves like a glitch in the software of reality, where the victim is often very young or very old or highly intelligent. They disappear near water or granite formations, and the dogs fail to find a scent while the search is hampered by sudden and violent storms that wash away any potential evidence. When the bodies are found, they are often miles away from where they vanished, in locations that seem impossible for them to have reached on foot. Sometimes they are found in areas that had been searched dozens of times before, only for the remains to appear out of nowhere as if they had been dropped from a great height. Think about the disappearance of Keith Reinhard in the town of Silver Plume, Colorado, which happened just a few miles away from where Jaryd vanished, but about a decade earlier. Keith was a journalist who became obsessed with the disappearance of another man named Tom Young who had vanished in the same woods. Keith told his friends he was going for a hike to the top of Pendleton Mountain, and he was never seen again despite an exhaustive search that lasted for months. His disappearance happened in an area known for its strange magnetic anomalies and a history of unexplained sightings in the sky. It is as if certain locations on this planet act as a sort of trap or a doorway that only opens under specific conditions that we do not yet understand. Then you have the case of Danny Filippidis, who was a firefighter on a ski trip in Lake Tahoe when he vanished from the mountain without a trace. He was found 6 days later in Sacramento, California, which is over 100 miles away, and he was still wearing his ski boots and helmet. He had no memory of how he got there, and his clothes were clean despite the fact that he should have been trekking through the snow for days. He told investigators that he felt like he had been in a fog, and that he remembered the sound of a truck but nothing else. This is a man who was trained for survival, and yet he was found in a state of total confusion in a location that he could not have reached by any normal means of transportation. The more you look into these files, the more you realize that the world is a much stranger and more dangerous place than we are led to believe by the people in charge. We are told that the wilderness is a sanctuary, where we can go to find ourselves, but for many people, it is the place where they lose themselves forever. The rangers and the police will continue to blame the weather and the animals, because they do not have the courage to admit that they are dealing with something that does not follow our rules. They want you to stay on the trail and pay your entrance fees and keep your eyes on the ground instead of looking at what might be watching you from the shadows of the trees. Every time I see a missing person poster at a trailhead, I wonder if that person is truly gone, or if they are just waiting in the silence between the heartbeats of the forest. There is a coldness that settles in your marrow when you realize that the people who should be protecting us are just as baffled and frightened as we are. They collect the data and they file the reports and they lock the evidence away in basements where it will never see the light of day because the truth is too much for the public to handle. We are living on the surface of a world that has deep and dark places, where the sun never reaches and where the ancient things still dwell. They do not want our technology or our money or our respect, because they have been here longer than we have and they will be here long after we are gone. When you go into the woods, you are a guest in a house that does not want you there, and you should always remember to look behind you when the birds stop singing. I often think about Jaryd Atadero's shoes sitting on that rock, and I wonder if he was the one who put them there, or if it was a gesture from the thing that took him. Was it a trophy, or a warning, or simply a piece of trash discarded by a force that has no use for human belongings? We will likely never know the answer, because the mountain does not give up its secrets easily, and the wind has a way of blowing away the voices of the lost. All we can do is keep searching the records and looking for the patterns that the authorities want to ignore. We are the investigators of the impossible, and the chroniclers of the vanished, and we will not stop until the silence is finally broken. The patterns are there if you are willing to see them, and they point to a reality that is far more complex and terrifying than any ghost story or urban legend. We are talking about thousands of people who have vanished without a trace in our national parks, and the number only continues to grow every year. It is a quiet epidemic that is happening right under our noses while we are distracted by the noise of the modern world. But the woods are still there, and they are still hungry, and they are waiting for the next person to step off the trail and into the unknown. If you decide to go out there, make sure you tell someone where you are going, and whatever you do, do not go alone. Because the silence is louder than you think, and it is closer than you realize. The case of Jaryd Atadero is just one leaf in a forest of tragedies that spans generations and continents. In the late 1800s, a young girl named Martha Mowry disappeared in the hills of Pennsylvania while picking berries with her family, and she was found days later at the top of a mountain that was considered inaccessible to adults. In 1946, a college student named Paula Weldon vanished on the Long Trail in Vermont, and despite one of the largest searches in state history, not a single clue was ever found. These cases share the same DNA of impossibility and the same sense of a predatory intelligence at work in the wild places of the earth. We are part of a long line of victims, and we are the only ones who can tell their stories before they are forgotten by history. As we close the file on this particular case, I want you to remember that the next time you are out in nature and you feel that sudden chill on the back of your neck, it might not just be the wind. It might be the weight of 1,000 eyes watching you from the granite and the brush, waiting for you to make one wrong turn. The wilderness is a beautiful place, but it is a beauty that is skin deep, and beneath it lies an ancient and indifferent hunger. Stay on the trail and keep your children close, and never assume that you are safe just because you can see the parking lot. The missing are still out there in the high country and the deep woods, and they are waiting for us to find them in the silence. And maybe one day we will, but for now, the mystery remains as cold and hard as the mountain stone.